Welcome back to the Firefighter Craftsmanship Podcast, where we guide you through the psychology of high performance, expand your mindset, and strengthen your resilience. And today we're definitely meeting that mission statement with our newly found friend, Jadie Miller from north of the border up in Canada. Good morning, Jadie. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
We're very excited to get a chance to talk to you. And, this is an expansion from a great episode that we had with Mr. Clark from Boise, Idaho, in the Forging Wellness Conference. And very excited as he was talking about, yeah, JD up in Canada is doing some cool stuff. And JD. I'm like, who is this JD person he's talking about? And I'm psyched. So thank you to him for introducing us and getting us on the podcast. So we're going to unpack some fun stuff today, and we're all going to learn some stuff together. So, JD, tell us a little bit about yourself and why we're having this chat right now.
Well, I am a firefighter in Ontario, Canada. That's the north of the border. Canadian JD, I think, as you've been referring to me thus far. But yeah, I've been a firefighter for 17 years plus. I've had a sort of a diverse professional background, starting with volunteer. Did 6 years at a full-time department down south, and then decided to have a family that pulled me up north of Ontario, just because that's where all my resources kind of lived, the husband, the in-laws, and all that kind of stuff. But I've had the privilege of having a kind of a cross section between, a northern, southern, and a volunteer department. So that's kind of fun. And we're talking because Jesse hooked us up. But the reason why he hooked us up is just because of exactly what you mentioned before, which was Firefighter Syndrome, which sort of was something I stumbled upon, we'll call it almost 7 or 8 years ago, when I sort of hit a wall, and hit a place in my career where I kind of had really just enough energy to take a step back and go, what was that? Because I was experiencing something I had never experienced before. So that really sent me on a tailspin of research, searching, challenging, sort of not accepting what they.com kept telling me was could have been the issues when it didn't feel right. Um, all to explore what firefighter syndrome could be, was, and for sure is. So here we are.
Awesome. Yeah. And where did firefighter syndrome come from? I mean, what does that mean? Does it mean that we like to sit in a lazy boy and eat eat during game day, or what does firefighter syndrome mean? Because I think we could put a lot of things in there that maybe is a quote unquote syndrome, but what are you talking about?
Sure. Well, at the end of the day, the most, firehouse way of describing firefighter syndrome is the stuff about our job that causes injury. So is it the lazy boy and the bag of chips watching the football game? Might be. That might be. Is it 3 o'clock in the morning when you're jamming a peanut butter wrap sandwich down your gullet because you're trying to survive because you're sleep deprivated? Yep, it's that too. But at the end of the day, it's a framework. It's a proposed framework that demonstrates and is very, very mappable, if you will, to the profession of firefighting. And it's just a bunch of stuff that we take for granted in this profession, and we don't look at, or we push aside and continually push aside. And we end up in a place where we wake up one day and we go, I'm not myself. You look in the mirror and you go, I don't recognize myself. I don't feel the same. For me, it was a structure fire, and we got on route to the structure fire. We got reports that there was a person trapped in the basement, which should have been like the Super Bowl of firefighting because it's in the name, you know. So, but I didn't feel anything, and I got out of the truck. I was completely empty, which for me is totally not normal because I cry every Friday, and I kind of use my emotions as a dipstick of how I'm doing. But in this particular moment in time, all I could feel was anger, or nothing at all. And I went through a season of that. And so firefighter syndrome was born of something called operator syndrome by Dr. Chris Bree and his team out of the States. And he comes from University of Hawaii. And in kind of my season, or in my storm where I was like, what the heck is going on with me? I had pursued the PTSD because that was the, air quotes of injury of firefighters. And I thought, well, I just want to get back to my crew, want to get back to sort of what normalcy could be. On the outside, I looked healthy. I was fit. I was working out, pushing, all the limits whenever I could. So I just figured, okay, it's psychological. But stumbled upon Dr. Christopher, like I say, out of Hawaii, and his work with operator syndrome, which is specializes in military operators such as PJ Rangers, Navy SEALs. He'd been in that with like 30 years, and they started to see job-related issues specific to that community. And so they called it operator syndrome and created a framework for them. And so when I was going through my sort of season, I reached out to him and I said, hey, I think operator syndrome is totally mappable to firefighter syndrome. And more than that, I think our community, like as in firefighting, is sort of getting it wrong in how we're taking care of each other. I think that this framework could really make a difference. I think you're the dude that's going to be able to help us. Would you like to meet little old Jadie from a farm in Ontario, big old fancy Hawaii? And he said yes. So we worked together for several years, mapped the framework, worked with the University of Hawaii, and you can find the publication on his website, Dr. Chris Freeh, Freeh spelled Frueh, or Pyrock's website, pyroc.com website. And there's also a questionnaire that you can take a look at. And it really is about guiding you through your journey in what you feel some of the issues are and what you as an individual feel you can work on, or identify in having like an honest conversation about, what firefighter syndrome is and what it could be, what it looks like to you, but what it looks like to your crew in your firehouse, or but also what it looks like to your family, and kind of getting everybody involved in making behavioral changes so you can kind of get to the end of your career and not have that, what was that moment that I experienced.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point, with the firefighter syndrome, and morphing it from the operator syndrome, which, after doing some research, after having that conversation with you, he's done a lot of research around operator syndrome. And that would be something like when you talk to people, especially in emergency services community, they'd be like, oh yeah, maybe I wasn't a war fighter. But I could absolutely see why those things lined up. And then, yes, this is the end result of that, one of which could be PTSD. And then when we try to bring that back to emergency services, whether it's fire, EMS, police, there are definitely some cross correlations with that. But then there's also these weird things, right? Where most operators don't have an average career length of 20 to 30 years. Right? Most of them are a shorter time period. And so when you look at the fire service specifically, most occupations, they don't go and essentially have a second family and they live with those people every single day for the entire duration of their work week, quote unquote. And so there are some things that hit, and then there's some things that also be like, oh, I don't know if that really applies to us. And so I think it's kind of cool that you guys maybe chase that string a little bit of saying, hey, is there correlation that we can actually research and framework and map and put a name to things? I think in our industry, we like to put a name to it so we can put a solution to it, right? It's like, oh, that person's in cardiac arrest. I know exactly what to do, regardless of the emotional aspect of this. I know the parts and pieces. I know how to force that commercial outward swinging door. I know how to deal with, right, that assailant if I'm a police officer or whatever. And so I think that it helps quantify that a little bit.
Well, it identifies the why, right? And so in our profession, our logical brain always challenges why. Police, EMS, fire, it's always the same way. It's a little bit more freedom in asking why than, and I'm speculating right now, but perhaps in the military would have. The military are given direct orders, they execute. That's what they do. In our particular arena, our ability to compartmentalize might be 20-minute sections, or a 24-hour section or a 48-hour section, in where you're popping into a situation, but then you come out and you go into a secondary situation. So that the logical why is the piece that we bring with us to each moment that we are working to compartmentalize. Does that make sense? So when you understand the why, it becomes interrelated and usable, and you can adapt it and you can apply it to, in firefighter syndrome, there are 19 different domains. Domains is just a fancy word for category or group or section. And what that means is that these 19 different subjects, categories, they're interrelated. And when you start to understand that if I went to a structure fire, last night, and I had a heavy dose of, smoke just through absorption. I had my BA on, I had my gear on, all the good stuff. But you know what? Guess what? You still sucked it up through your pores, no matter how hard you try, right? So the next 48 might be 48 hours for me, could be 2 weeks for you. I'm putting blood cuffs upside down. I can't find the doohickey thingamabobber because I can't remember what it's called. Those are signs and symptoms of the fact that I've just taken in some toxins, and those toxins are presenting as a mild concussion, and that's something called toxic encephalopathy. Um, whether it's acute, whether it's chronic, it all starts to play in. But now I'm like, okay, I'm feeling a little dumb right now because I can't, remember where I put my car keys, worse than normal. And I know that I went to a structure fire last night. So you know what? I got to give myself some grace and some time to just kind of move through this because I now know what's going on with me. I'm not suffering PTSD because I'm angry. My adrenal system has taken a hit because I sucked up some smoke. There's a difference. Um, so that why becomes powerful.
Yeah, and when you frame like that example there, it shows the impact of the job over long periods of time on things that we can't control. So yeah, we might have a great culture around wearing our PPE and our SCBA, our face piece. Um, but yeah, we know like CO absorbs through the ears. And so that there's another
Mm-hmm.
one there where even if you have a hood on, you're still absorbing CO through the ears. And there's some good research out there around that. And so there's some things that we can control and there's some things that we can't. And to me, a lot of that just comes into, hey, I know what the risks are with the occupation. And we're learning more and more and more about these risks. And that's where I think, firefighter syndrome really puts another level to that of these are some of the other risks of the occupation that we have chosen to do. Um, but it also gives us a framework on how to deal with that. Or right, here's why hydration is important. Or as we like to talk a lot about here on the Firefighter Craftsmanship Podcast, is here's why sleep is so important and controlling the controllables, because I can't control when you call 911, but I certainly can control how I act and operate and what routines I have on my days off for the most part. And so those sorts of choices fall into this for sure.
The state, and when you're on shift too, it's controlling what's going on in shift, right? So the attitude, you come into shift, and a lot of us have secondary jobs or just additional stresses at home. You come in and then you come in with an unselected attitude, and you don't check it, because you're dealing with whatever you bringing in from home. And so that transition from home into workplace becomes a whole other new dynamic of challenge that you have to face, right? So understanding, okay, I had, you know, two fires last shift. I was home for one shift. I didn't get a chance to eat or hydrate or sleep. Now I'm back and I'm not really in the best mood. I don't want to participate in training. Um, Having that ability to check yourself and be fully aware of where you are in your own personalized journey is critical to navigating the combination of stuff inside firefighting that causes firefighters to go to a place where they may not return. We had just in this last week, there was a firefighter in North America that I'm aware of that, again, another one, I'm sure there's more, but committed suicide. Um, it's this compounding issue that pushes us into hurt locker. And unless we know where we are in that locker, but also have the ability to check each other, be like, you know what, this is where you're at. Put your blood work on the table. Let's do this, right? Go get your blood work done. Have you had a sleep study done? You know, a lot of these things that we just kind of like keep pushing through because we have a craving, for lack of a better term, to meet society's expectation of us as being heroes, right? I get it. I've got it. I went through it. I do it. I love it. I appreciate being a part of that perspective. But you know what? The culture in our house now is because the guys that I work with, they're familiar with firefighter syndrome. They'd be like, you need to go have a nap. You're out of control. Right? So we're able to hold each other accountable. We're able to put our blood work on the table and say, here, this is where I'm at, you know, and have those really critical conversations, which is huge.
Yeah, that's really good stuff. And I think having that tribe of people around you that can say, "Hey, you're being kind of a diva. You either need to eat something, you need to drink something, you need to," right? And that's not a gender specific term by any means.
No, no.
So like, hey, go take a nap, or creating that culture of, we got absolutely punked last night, and today we are actually changing what was on the calendar because it's something that we can make up at another time where we're actually going to learn something, maybe basic skills training. Or we're going to modify the basic skills, or we're going to modify what our physical fitness routine looks like today and maybe do mobility stuff because we know the correlation between sleep deprivation and injuries and workplace injuries, on and on and on, right? And then, it's really up to us at that crew level or personal level initially, but then the crew level to start to drive that thing. And you'll have a lot of organizational pushback. Let's just call it like it is, of like, well, we got stuff to do. Things have to happen business wise and blah, 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 blah. And then you can correlate that back to, okay, what's the mission? Why do we exist? Why are we here? And by me taking a nappuccino, or a 90-minute nap or a 30-minute nap or whatever, or going to bed for the first time in 24 hours, if you're on a 48-96, does that support the overall mission or not? And I've gone on my soapbox quite a bit here about there's a lot of difference between sleep and laziness, and we have to start to break that. And so we know people that sleep all the time that are super lazy. We know people that never sleep and they're super lazy. And so we need to separate those terms out. And I think, by addressing a thing like firefighter syndrome with 19 different domains, it just starts to put a language around that and say, hey, this potentially is currently a normal progression. Should it be that way? Yes or no? And if not, then what are the actionable items that we can start to create personally, crew level, battalion, shift level, whatever you call that, and then department organizational level on empowering and protecting our people.
100%. And that was like, I got goose pimples, Canadian goose pimples right now, because you just hit the nail on the head. The intended purpose of firefighter syndrome, Dr. Chris Free is a brilliant 300 plus, publications, wrote the textbook on PTSD. And when we started working together, I said, can we publish this, incredible findings in a layman magazine called Crackle, which is the Canadian, shout out to my Crackle boy. Because I truly believe that if firefighters get it first and they see value in it and they understand it and they can put their minds around it, because they're so incredibly logical, and we talked about this before in our last conversation, which was a firefighter loves research. It's just usually they're researching how to build something or where to buy something, or how do you benefit from this product versus that product. And if you have the odd guy, he's trying to figure out some forcible entry stuff too, but love research, right? So if that's the case, we look at this community and we say, we're going to give you this and your research, we're going to give you this framework, and all we're asking is that you do the research, for you, for your family, for the civilians. Not for the chief right now, because we get the dynamics of that relationship. But also, on the flip side, that framework, a battalion chief can say, okay, I get where these injuries are coming from. PTSD is real, but not every firefighter has PTSD. So what is it? It's a combination of stuff, aka firefighter syndrome. So here's how I now manage. A true leader manages their people by seeing the whole picture. What are the 19 different domains that firefighter syndrome is? And how do I manage my people around those? And then, if you have a dialed in chief who cares a lot about their folks too, they're saying, hey, I have firefighter syndrome. I have access to firefighter syndrome too, if they know about it just yet. But hopefully that's one of the great things about being on your podcast, is you're helping us share the awareness of firefighter syndrome. So thank you for that. But now you have a chief and a battalion and a firehouse that shut up might be on the front door. That ain't never going to happen, right? But what if it does? Now we start a career longevity. Like in North America, the financial impact on taxpayers for the rest and recovery of firefighters is colossal. It's more than $79 billion. And there's a calculation how we came to that number, but at the end of it, it's more than that. That's just a fragment of what the impact is. So if we can get on the same page, guess what? We have a reallocation of budget that we can, hire full-time firefighters. We can buy new trucks. We can buy better gear instead of buying the cheap gear, right? Like, we can do this, but it means we work together. And so when Dr. Chris Free published that article in Crackle, the goal was that magazine comes to the coffee table and we have a wicked conversation about how do we do this together. You've been on your soapbox a couple times on the show, which I love. Soapboxes, they're great places to be, about sleep. So in the firehouse, my chief might kill me, but I'm going to say it. In our house, we have, times of the day where we shut down. No, nothing. We've selected, we know our rhythm, we know the heartbeat of our particular station. So we've picked a time and we say, this is when we shut down. You don't sleep. That's cool, but you're going to shut down because you don't know what's coming tonight. And you know what? I'm not going to make fun of you because I understand the why, which is firefighter syndrome. Here we go. Let's do this. You know what I mean?
I do. Yeah. I think it's a great conversation to finally have organizationally, and just control at whatever level you're at of impact or influence, And I think the correlation between this stuff and this conversation that we're having today, and we're going to get into the parts and pieces. I can hear people be like, tell me what some of the pieces are, right? But is the correlation is, when I ask that question to almost everybody at some regard, what's the biggest problems we're dealing with in fire, EMS, police, and it's retention and recruitment are the two things that usually come back. And so when we look at retention and recruitment, it's not just sitting on the porch being like, oh, dang it, I really wish they wouldn't leave. And I really wish we had more applicants, but we're going to continue to do the same thing that we've done forever. Right. Or, oh, well, it's just because this next generation doesn't want to work, or some other nonsense that we try to blame it on, versus saying, well, what about the people that are healed right now? Like, that is retention. And what are the things that we're doing to make them have autonomy at work, have happiness at work? Maybe that has nothing to do with a raise. They might not actually want more time off, right? Like, the status thing maybe is not that big of a deal to them as far as rank and promotion. So what are some of these things that we can do for retention? First off, let's start there. If you retain your people and you have a happy and healthy workforce, they are going to be your recruitment, right? Word of mouth is the best type of marketing. And so they're going to go out and be like, hey, this is an amazing thing. Not only is this an amazing occupation, but this department right here is where you want to be, and let that thing grow, And so I think that, like, we're just sitting around and complaining about recruitment and retention. And then a lot of organizations are literally doing nothing about it except blaming the workforce on, well, we shouldn't be leaving because whatever reason, And so let's kind of dive into some of the parts and pieces. We don't need to go into all 19 by any means, but what are the big ticket items for firefighter syndrome? And I think when people hear this, they're going to be like, well, I mean, I've heard of that. I've heard of that. I've heard of that. But firefighter syndrome has kind of packaged it all together, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. This is a loaded question because again, it's interconnected. But I would, if I had to pick my top three, obviously sleep. That's a tough one because we've had this conversation before. We're not going to get into it today, but the Canadian schedule is much different than the US schedule and it's embarrassing. But our Canadian and specifically Ontario region paid, our union paid for sleep studies that demonstrated scientifically the ridiculous impacts that 90 plus percentage of the United States are suffering because of the way that you guys work. Uh, and so the sleep schedule, the only time you get to recover is during sleep. So when we continue to wear that badge of honor that says sleep is for the weak or I'll sleep when I die, um, you're robbing both yourself, your family, your roommates, and the civilians from an incredible version of yourself. And that's not fair. So just question that. Sit down and say, like, where am I at with all of this? That goes back to our need to control situations and maybe not understand um, what things are good to let go of and what things are not okay to let go of. And again, I totally value that. Been there, done that, got a few t-shirts. But the sleep piece is it's like a medical treatment. If you look at sleep as a medical treatment for the profession, you require it. It is a non-negotiable. So if you can wrap your mind around that, then step one is you're in the right direction. The number two piece is kind of a hidden because when we think about we talked about it a few moments ago, toxic encephalopathy, which is just a really hard tongue-tying twisted way of saying toxin absorptions or exposure. What happens is it goes into your body and it creates damage to your brain in many different ways, and again, I challenge you all listening to do your own research about what's going on with that. But it presents like a concussion. So, and then it leads to maybe something that could be traumatic brain injury. Well, we know traumatic brain injuries happen when we hit them or we have, impacts to our brain, but they also happen when we are exposed to chemicals. And so, why does that matter? That matters because TBIs mimic much and a lot of symptoms found in PTSD. So if you are seeking help for PTSD, kudos to you. Congratulations. You're already way ahead of the game and to not be, devalued. But I also want you to stop, think about your career and think about some of your exposures. And those exposures, like even we just learned, our gear is a problem. Some of the fire retardants in our, uniforms is a problem. Where is your medical bag on the truck? Is it, sitting right beside the diesel exhaust? Are you wearing a medical glove when you're pumping gas? Or sorry, diesel, not gas. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna get ripped for that one. Um, those are all compounding absorptions. So if you're feeling hypervigilant, aka I want to scream at everybody or everybody's out to get me, if you're feeling anxiety, depression, those core things that you see inside PTSD, you might be suffering the effects of a traumatic brain injury induced by chemical exposures. So that's sort of the other one that I would really like everybody to stop and sort of recognize. Um, and then so we talked about it, and I want to bring it in too because we talked about it right at the beginning of the show, which is that work to home transition, which is sort of like the top three that I find in my career have been the most sort of hidden compounding component to the injury that I received. I remember I was coming home from shift and it was like a Saturday, and I was making my 5-year-old daughter do laundry. And I was like, put your laundry away. And I was angry and I was furious. And I'm like, she's 5 and I'm mom and I'm screaming at her. And my daughter, I just couldn't, I hadn't given myself the transition time to come home. And when I got in the house, I just, stuff needed to get done. You know, I'm running the house and I'm in her bedroom. And kudos to my daughter. She had the balls to turn around and say, Mom, sit down beside me. And she said, I feel like I'm losing my mom. And that's when it just really all sort of came crashing down for me, because I was able to say, this is another piece of a very important part of my particular puzzle, which is understanding how much time I need to come back home, but also what my transition into work looks like. Do I need a routine? What does that look like? How do I transition? How do I compartmentalize to ensure that I've given that decompression time that's required to come in and out of the environments that I serve? And that service is to my family, but also to my community. Um, some people might be struggling with the sexual intimacy. I was there as well. The idea of when my husband would kind of wrap his arms around me, I was like, don't touch me. I just couldn't. I was like, I don't want this. Just even just to show affection. Um, um, the anxiety, depression, hypervigilance. Hypervigilance was bad for me too, because I I just felt like I would walk into the room and everybody would stop talking and I'd be like, "Yep, I know you talk about me, aren't you?" Right? And I would get like super defensive. Why is it? Because I'm a girl? Totally went down that rabbit hole. Absolutely. And then I started to realize that I was putting those pressures on myself. I am a good firefighter. I am a good contributor to my team. But because I was suffering all of these compounding issues, I started to internalize and started to look at myself as being the enemy. And so then that was projecting out as a way of just being hyper vigilant against my environment. And that's another indicator when you're like, I don't feel like I can do anything good enough for this team, or the department's not recognizing me for X, Y, and Z. Um, where are you at in your journey? Fill out your scale. What's really important to me is that everybody acknowledges that my scale will be different than your scale. And my scale was filled out with my husband. Can you fill yours out with your significant other? Do you have a crewmate that you can hang out with? A lot of departments have peer support systems, which are great tools when they work, but they're also incredibly damaging tools when they don't work. So we need to take that role very seriously. But is there somebody on your department in that position that you are close with? So, like I said, there's 19, eating peanut butter or sugar, laden pizza at 3 o'clock in the morning and then going to bed. Now you're starting to disrupt your nutrition. The mitochondria in your stomach require an ability, in the gut biome in your stomach need an environment to communicate well with the mitochondria in your body and produce hormones, and it gets complex from there. So again, do your research. What are your habits? What do they look like? I'm keep going, but I don't know if you have any questions at this point.
No, yeah, keep going. And thank you for sharing those stories, some of that certainly resonates with me. And I know that it resonates with our listeners because I'm having these conversations with some people that listen to the show. And, I think the thing is what we're trying to do is say, hey, most of us love the occupation, you hear it all the time. It's the greatest job in the world. And then you'll hear that from somebody who is like the most negative and burned out person that you've ever been around, and they'll still say, oh, it's the greatest job in the world. And it's like, well, how can it be better then? Right. So it hasn't peaked. So you might still love the basic skills. You might still love the 911 call side of that. But man, you're pretty fired up about some of the other stuff, maybe totally justifiably so, especially when it relates to like organizational culture and things like that. But also now correlating that to, hey, there is a physiological impact of the occupation. There's certainly a psychological impact of the occupation, which we're getting lots and lots of airtime around, which is amazing. And, peer supports and a lot of good conversation around PTSD and all this sort of stuff. But it doesn't mean you're going to get PTSD. And it doesn't necessarily mean it is PTSD, right? I mean, that's kind of how you found this operator syndrome stuff is, you essentially were labeled as having PTSD and you're like, but I don't meet those metrics.
Yeah, it wasn't fitting the bill for me. It didn't feel right in my gut. And I'm a logical thinker. So I was like, okay, if logically, if it doesn't fit right, doesn't feel right, it might not be right. And so I just challenged. And that's what, I'm no one special. I really don't feel like there's a lot of me that feels like I don't deserve to be here. Talking to you about firefighter syndrome today. But what I what I do bring to the table is a very sincere and willingness to be vulnerable and share my story. When I wrote, there's an article in Crackle Again, which was the second article that we published for anybody that is kind of like looking for a safe place to compare their story in silence, with nobody else watching you compare your story. It's called I Have Something, but It's Not PTSD, Jadie's story. When I wrote that and we published it, like I remember like crying again. I was an emotional creature, right? I cry every Friday. I was writing it and I was crying because I was like, all I could picture was one firefighter, faceless, sitting in the dark by themselves, feeling like nothing's okay, but they didn't know where to go. And I was like, I'm going to write this. And I feared for my career. I feared for my reputation because I wasn't looking to stand on a soapbox, pound my chest, and be like, I'm going to fix the world. And I, I've experienced this, and I didn't want that. But I knew that if I was willing to be vulnerable, that that one firefighter that I was envisioning sitting alone in the dark, if they had the opportunity to read the article, then it would reach them. And that was great success for me. Growing up, and I've been very transparent about my childhood. By the time I was 8, my parents separated and I was living on the streets. And I went through some stuff. And during that season where, I was homeless and, no heat, no hydro, no food until the age of 12 and sort of 10 or 11 and got into a foster home. And by the age of 13, lived by myself the whole time and so on and so forth. And I really dug in to try to get this career as a firefighter. And you hear psychologists say, you have something to prove, and I am not ripping on psychologists. I love them. They have a place. But I am going to push back a little bit, especially in this arena, because we're talking to our people here, which is a psychologist doesn't ride the trucks. They are really good at helping us walk through difficult seasons. But the challenge that I have specifically, and you mentioned it before, is that we're really starting to talk about mental health and we're really starting to talk about PTSD. And this is great, but there's a pendulum. And I truly believe that the pendulum is swinging too far. I did have something to prove. I do have something to prove to my community. The experiences that I had as a child allows me to crawl up into a feces infected, blood everywhere environment because that's where I grew up. And now I have a strength that I can offer the community that I serve. These things that we go through, these traumas that we call it traumas, but they're adversities, they're challenges. They're not, they can be traumas, and I'm not talking about those ones that are like, they are PTSD and they do need a next level, and that's why it exists. What I'm talking about is the ones I don't want to devalue PTSD because it's a very significant, important piece of the equation. What I want to do is say that what you're going through, what I went through, what anyone can go through, it is a training ground, just like throwing ladders, just like sets and reps. When you go through something hard, it presents an opportunity for you to grow. And then when you grow, you get stronger, you get better. And my hope is that you look at firefighter syndrome and you see all these things for opportunities to identify 19 different domains to get better. You will be injured, you will go through hard times, but guess what? You get to use that. You get to get on that truck and be like, it's playtime. Flick the toggle switch, let's roll, right? It You don't need to look at it and go, I'm going to go get exposed to toxins again. I'm going to go pick up that dead baby. I've had that call. I've been to a call where a mother smashed her head with a hammer while her son played video games upstairs, and they didn't even like, there was no connection. It was cold as ice. And my ability was to, say, I can grow from these calls. I can take something. What can I take from this that's going to lend me to the next call? I need to eat right. I need to sleep right. I need to process what I've just been through. And guess what? I'm better when I come out of it. And so, my challenge in this particular podcast is to say, yes, trauma's hard. Yes, trauma's real, but it's an opportunity to get and be better and do better. Let's do it. And but if we do it together, we can challenge the culture and not allow the pendulum to swing too far into one particular direction. That next thing you know, the recruitment and the retention issues, we can't swing back from, because no one wants this job. Society has to have this profession. Has to. It's the oldest profession going because it's needed. Let's not lose the grit and the determination to prove something. Good. You have something to prove it? Go use it. Oh, there's my soapbox. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Well, it was a beautifully crafted response, and you did a nice job of we're never trying to devalue PTSD by any means. We're not trying to devalue mental health practitioners, peer support teams, any of that. We're just trying to, hey, this is amazing conversation we're finally having within the last 5 years. How do we exponentially make that better? And what are the other parts and pieces where it's not just all doom and gloom, which, we will, if you're on the rig for any amount of time, it could be 5 minutes, your very first day, and you have to run something that you're not built as a human to normally see and process. And as we know, like when it's your turn in the barrel, you run a bunch of those in a row. And so how do we build resilience from that? And resilience to me means that bending and not breaking and springing back, learning from those experiences, not discounting them or just pushing them deep down and dark, but really saying, yeah, that was a terrible day. And every time I drive by that place, there's going to be some twinge of like, that day sucked, right? And that's okay. That's a totally normal human experience. But how do I learn from that? How can I get better? Hey, we gave that patient the best possible chance based on the situation that we were given, or whatever. And I think that now it's the time for us to have the conversation, because we have great basic skills training that's happening all over the world. Now, how do we basic skills train physiology, psychology, resilience, and especially resilience before we need it? And I think by having a framework like Firefighter Syndrome specifically, with 19 very clearly laid out things, and, as Brian Buffini, who's a real estate guy, says, eat the meat and throw away the bones. So if you're like, hey, there was some stuff in the Crackle article from Dr. Frew that I was like, well, I don't necessarily agree with that, but it doesn't mean I just push delete on the whole thing. It's like, okay, just like you, I'm going to push back a little bit. Like, so all of these resources, of course, are linked in the show notes, and you can access all of this stuff. But read it, challenge it, be like, am I challenging it because I just don't want to believe it, or it's going to cost my department too much money, right? If I'm in a position that I control budgets and I'm a chief of department or organization, well, I don't want to believe that, because if I do, then I have to do something about it. Well, now you found the spot where you really got to try to grow and figure out how do we get creative? Is it through outside consultants, through grants, through people that probably already exist in your organization and they're passionate about some of these things? Um,
Oh, yeah.
how do we get a little bit better today than we were tomorrow? You know, and I think that so really, really well said for sure.
Mm. Well, thank you. I mean, I I just really hope that people don't um, look past this and say, it's not me. If it's not you, look around your truck. Who is it? And really, the place to start is in the firehouse. It's in the station. It's in the barn, whatever you call it. Whatever country or region of the world you live in. But the place to start the cultural change is in your house. You define house. Is the house you require to change the one you work in or the one you live in? Or is it both? Right? It all boils down to accountability for you. My ability to be vulnerable is where I believe strength lives, where I believe bravery lives. Being brave doesn't, it's not at the front door going into the structure fire. It's in the title. You knew what you were getting in on. If you didn't, it's a whole other conversation, maybe another podcast. But bravery happens at the coffee table because people like, firefighters like stories. I'll give one last story. I had a call Christmas Eve and I was not at my home station. I'd rolled out for coverage another station, and we got a call. We'll call it just about midnight, stereotypical midnight call. Street racers. We rolled up on scene, and the car was the same car as my stepson. Lived in the same area that my stepson was, and I thought, no, Lord, please don't be this. Please don't be him. And we rolled up on scene, and I got there, and I was in charge of passenger side and extricated the patient at that particular moment, and then came around to got that female passenger off to the ambulance and rolled around to the driver's side. Started to do compressions on the driver, and while we were trying to do extrication at the same time because he went VSA in the vehicle. And when we were in and we were doing the extrications, um, I looked down at this young man's face and he looked exactly like my son. And I really struggled. I have never had a moment in my time of my career where I felt the way that I felt. I was blinking my eyes, staring at his face, going, is this you? Is this you? What is happening? Right? What is happening? And it was like this outer body experience where I was absolutely relating to the call. And through my experience that I see as strength in dealing with trauma, I knew enough to associate myself to something that disassociated me from the call. So I found his running shoes. They were nasty. My boy would not be wearing those things. So what I mean by that is they were not his style. So I hung on to those shoes for dear life to get that boy out of the car. We were very successful. Unfortunately, the young man passed away. Get out of the truck, get off scene, get back into the truck. We're heading back to Hall. Captain goes, "Oh, that was a tough call. Is everybody okay?" Because we all hear those. That question always hits the table. Everybody all right? I said, "No, I'm not." Now, unfortunately, that captain was not ready for that answer. But when I got back to my house with my crew, how I handled it was talking about it. We reenacted the scene. We went off to the auto extrication um, staging that we have where we can go and play around with our tools. I wanted to know how we could have done it faster. I wanted to know how, and I just like asked questions. and I fulfilled and I answered all my questions. And then in the morning, when I got off shift, I called my son and I said, I love you. I'm proud of the man that you're becoming. I am leaving nothing unsaid that I would regret not saying. So I'm saying it all to you in person while I have you. And it turned out to be a really powerful conversation. But my willingness to say I'm not okay, my willingness to say I need to learn more, my willingness to say that I need to go to the extrication grounds and play with the toys because maybe I forgot how to do this, or maybe I saw this and I didn't like the way it was happening. Well, that's on me. So my crew stepped up and supported me, and they got a lot from it. But the strength begins by saying, the accountability begins by saying, I'm not okay. And we have to do that more, but not to say that I'm injured, to say it so I can get stronger. And we have to flip the switch on that. It's not about screaming to say I have an injury and so I'm out of service. No, it says I have an injury, so I need to start my rehab, my sets and reps, so I can do really great the next time around. It is not until we become honest and be willing to say we're not okay, that's where the strength is. That's where the bravery is. And I just think that if we get the opportunity to unlock that new culture, it's going to be hard. I get it. I get it. But if we can unlock that, we're going to go really far in a profession that has exponential potential.
Really powerful stuff. Yeah. And thank you again for sharing, for sharing that. And, yeah, I think it's the perfect example of growth from a really, really bad day, and you grew basic skills, but you grew your family dynamic, you grew personally, you grew the profession, right? Because you were willing to go first. And by far, that's the hardest thing that we can possibly do. You see it at every single training class, right? We teach the recruits in academy when an instructor says, who wants to go first? Like, the expectation is everybody raises their hand at the same time, right? Of somebody's got to go first. And are we creating learning environments, or are we creating places where, well, you better know how to do this very first time, even though you've never seen that tool or whatever, this technique. And so that all has to start internally and eating our egos initially, and this job is really, really good, regardless of what branch of service you're in. This job is fantastic at finding you and kicking you straight in the face, right? That's just the reality of it. Mm-hmm. So once we say, hey, here, it's coming, right? It might not have happened yet, but at some point you're going to get kicked right in the teeth by the occupation, right? How am I going to deal with that? And more so, it's going to come in a way that you weren't expecting. So now how do I get better from that? And how long does that take? And sometimes, and really a lot of times, that probably requires some sort of professional intervention, whether that's a clinician or something along those lines, for sure.
But I mean, I wouldn't have gotten through that situation if it wasn't for my crew. They deserve recognition. The only thing I did was be willing to step up and say, I need help in a professional way. I needed to revisit, I wasn't on the tools that day. And so the fact that I wasn't on the tools that day was bothering me. I needed to get on the tools to work through the emotions that I was feeling associated to working hard to disassociate from that scene. So getting on the tools was a coping mechanism for me, and they walked me through everything. But I've also been a part of a house where that support doesn't exist, and so I can hear the firefighter that's maybe driving or be like, yeah, well, I've got that in my house. giving me the gears right now. And I hear you. I hear you. Go to the house that you do know that exists, or do your own studying. Jump on YouTube. What does it take? But dig inside, look what you're missing, and kind of scroll through the Rolodex and be like, do I need help with this? No, it doesn't feel right. Do I need help with this? No, it doesn't feel right. Do I need to talk to a counselor? You know, that doesn't feel right. Well, what do I need? I need to call my son and tell him I love him. Yeah, that one feels right.
Yeah.
Right. So you just kind of roll through your own roles and just say, where am I? Ask. You're the only one who knows how to ask your questions. If firefighter syndrome allows you to create your own questions by a checklist of creating your own questions, then mission accomplished. That's what we were working to do, is to help empower you or us as firefighters to change the dynamics of our own personal journey and no longer be shuttled, down the aisle with everybody else, because they only ever treat us for PTSD.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you were talking, about like maybe some of those trigger points of saying, hey, I wasn't on the tools, but I actually processed the emotion by getting on there in a training environment. I just saw a thing the other day about, the American football player, Damar Hamlin, who, with the Buffalo Bills, who got hit in the chest and suffered cardiac arrest on the field in front of the entire world to see, and luckily survived that incident. And they were interviewing him, and he talked about some of the hardest things. It wasn't actually stepping back on the football field. He didn't realize the correlation to things like putting on his jersey or putting in his mouthpiece. And so I use that as an example because this is a human experience. And the things that you as a listener out there are experiencing is because you're a human and you're not alone. And there is hope if you're in a place where you feel like you're hopeless. There is hope. Some of those have systems and tools around them to help, but there's for sure professionals out there, whether it's, well, I really blew it because I didn't know how to use the cutters on that extrication call. Well, there's absolutely professionals that can help you. And there's people in your department that if you're willing to go first and say, man, I need some help, or I'm worried that this is coming, And so like one thing I try to teach in all of our classes is if there's a stingy point, right? If I'm teaching ladders and you really don't want to throw the 28-foot ladder, whatever. I don't know how many meters that is in Canada, right? But if you really, really, really don't want to do a single person 24, okay,
Yeah.
then that is the thing that you should say, hey, I have this twinge of I'm intentionally trying to avoid that thing. And this should be an environment that's safe. And if it's not, then creating that environment at some other point, maybe after class with another recruit or with an instructor that you trust or whatever, and being like, I'm going to go out and I'm going to intentionally attack that twinge and get after it. And that's really, really hard to do that. It's really hard to do
Can
that.
you use twinge to fill out your firefighter's questionnaire, for firefighter syndrome? That same twinge where you're like, okay, sexual intimacy issues, twinge, slow your roll, buff, come on back, you know. Um, so that that twinge is applicable when you're filling out your scale. What do you do with that scale? You take that scale to your GP if you have one, and I understand that there's a whole other podcast that we can talk about how broken the medical system is, but be an advocate for yourself. So what does that look like? Fill out your scale, be honest, check your survey, use the twinge, go get your blood work done, check for your testosterone, your cortisol, your estrogen. Yeah, I said estrogen, even for the dudes. And get a sleep study, prioritize sleep, check out, and I suffered, we'll call it, for 7 years. It was a long time. And I am 4 years, maybe 5, on the other side of my journey. And I still don't have all the pieces put together. And I might not ever. So don't expect that you're going to have everything fixed in 6 months. I know the firefighter behavior is to get in and get her done. but give yourself grace, give yourself time. You're not alone. And just start plugging. Do your own research. Stop researching how to build a sauna and come on back and start researching how to fix your mitochondria. And I say that with love. So
And maybe fixing it is the sauna, but you just got to start building the thing, right? That was an easy setup for me right there. Right. So, I mean, real one last question, because I mean, you're just giving so many great things for people to kind of stew on and for us to finish. But the one question I have left is, how often should we assess and take this self-assessment for firefighter syndrome? What's your recommendation? Should it be like every year, sooner than that, longer than that? I mean, obviously you're going to probably take the, well, it's up to you angle, but what's like a general framework that you and Dr. Frew would actually recommend on this self-assessment?
well, with the firefighter answer is the ultimate answer in firefighter is come on,
It depends. Yeah.
depends.
Yeah.
Right? So it depends. What house do you work at? Do you work at the main house? Do you work at the cottage? So, really at the end of the day, at minimum, a year. But if your exposures are high, if your exposures are low, if your work life balance feels like something's off, um, if you want to do it every 2 months, if you're somebody with a bit of a significant OCD, because there's a few of us in this profession that have that, you're doing it every 6 months. If you're somebody who is kind of avoiding the situation and really doesn't want to participate, every 3 years, every 2 years. The scale dynamics are so intimate and personal. But the answer is just do the first one. And then you decide what you need from there. But do the first one right.
Brilliant. And it does depend, right? It definitely depends. And maybe even tracking it on that bell curve. We all have the highs of the bell curve and we all get in the trough at some point. Or when
Mm-hmm.
somebody is like, man, why are you so mad all the time? Maybe that's a good indicator of like, hey, I should probably do another self-assessment, or did I
Mm-hmm.
fall off of the wagon of the things I was actually trying to do um, here? And this the cool thing about firefighter syndrome, it's an empowerment tool. So if you're caught up on like, I don't
Mm-hmm.
have a syndrome, I'm not damaged, then just say it's firefighter empowerment tool, right? And so get out there, and it doesn't matter what occupation you're in. You can have your families do this sort of stuff because they're impacted by some of these things as well. Um, Build that community around you, and it certainly isn't tied to rank. And so as you move through your organization and whatever your chosen career path is, like you can still be impacted by these things, and then potentially you have greater impact on how to empower the next generation and leave it better than you found it by using this
Mm-hmm.
really cool framework, and these 19 modalities that you can say, hey, these are problems. Or maybe you're even like, well, they missed this one, like that's pretty cool. And I know JD would be like, yeah, please tell me about that.
Would. Yeah, I would say reach out to me right away. And you said it has no preference to rank. This scale goes all the way up to the chief. Chiefs suffer too. I've had a significant privilege to sit at the coffee table with chiefs when they are discussing some of the challenges that they have. And let me tell you, it's not easy to be a chief. If you're a probationary firefighter and you're like, hey, I don't have this syndrome, good. Use it as a tool to not get it. Or foresee if I stay on this trajectory as a firefighter, and here is the framework, then I'm going to end up in a very empty, dark place where I no longer have the capacity to serve. So use it as a tool so you don't get there. Don't wait till you're broken. We're trying to create a proactive solution. What do we do about complaining around the coffee table is, well, why are they doing it that way? If they only did it this way, well, then you get to be the master of your own domain and don't do it that way. And don't complain about how you didn't do something. And I'm being facetious, but the whole point is to say it's not a tool. What's different about firefighter syndrome versus only isolating into PTSD. Is PTSD is a reactive response. Firefighter syndrome is, our hope is that it's a proactive response. Use it so you don't get it. If you're in it, use it to mitigate it, navigate it so you can get out of it.
I love it. I love it. And of course, all the assessments and all these resources and research and all of that stuff is going to be linked through the show notes.
Awesome.
Or if you're on the weekly email list for Firefighter Craftsmanship, you will have all of those things in your inbox. So just create a little folder of badass stuff or something like that, right? That you can go back to, and uh, and then have that conversation. Be like, hey, I heard this bozo named Kevin on this podcast. He likes to talk a lot, and he had an actual amazing guest on there. And so, like, what I think this is kind of nonsense. What do you fellas think around the kitchen table? And then blame it on us, right? Like, start the conversation, and we'll be the scapegoats for it, or have them reach out to us at Firefighter Craftsmanship, or hopefully Jadie will provide some contact info or ways to get in touch with her, and we can have these conversations. And then that way it doesn't have to come from you. It can come from these weirdos in Canada and in Colorado, and you can use us as a scapegoat.
One of the things I love about firefighters, truly, 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 is we challenge everything. So challenge the framework. It needs to get better. We acknowledge that. So challenge it. And, I'm very cautious when I say, feel free to provide me feedback, but I want that feedback. We need, as a community, we need back. So if it doesn't jive with you or we are missing, one of the pieces that I fully acknowledge that we're missing and it needs to be addressed is spirituality. Where are you in your spirituality walk? There's no scale scientifically to measure that, but it is a very significant piece of the equation. So it's not there, but if you are someone who leans into that realm of healing, then consider it being there because it is.
I love it. I love it. How can people find you if you want them to?
I always want them to. So you can find me on my website, pyroc.com, pyroc.com. You can connect through me there. jadie.miller@pyroc.com is my email. You can find me on LinkedIn. Due to my learnings of social media and their impact on the cognitive rehab. I don't have social media where I'm active, but I do have social media. But if you reach me through there, I might not get back to you. So stick with the email and LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out, and I'd love to chat if only if it's a coffee and a conversation.
Thank you so much, Jadie. What great stuff. And hopefully it's a good thought-provoking exercise for our community here, and also that we can make these tools and assessments better, because not only for ourselves, but like you said, we have the right to show up for ourselves and the right to show up for our families and the people that care about us and love us, and we have the right to show up for our communities that we choose to serve, and all of those people, including ourselves, deserve that best version of ourselves. And I think that this really is a good foundational principle that we can build from. And you've put some really, really great, simple language to some pretty hard concepts and some heavy concepts. And I learned a ton of stuff just by starting my very, very initial research into some of these things of, how it's created some great conversations with my wife and I. My wife is an internal medicine PA. And so, like, she's able to kind of unpack some of those other, as far as like a primary care provider. If somebody comes to you, what would you say to this? And it's maybe challenge some of her understandings of things as well, of like, oh, well, this, I've never really thought about that, but let's try to figure out why that might actually be impactful. Or I don't actually think that specific blood test means very much because of blah, 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 blah. And so I think that that's a cool thing where you just have these conversations where it's not, hey, this is carte blanche and this is the only way to do it. It's, hey, let's start to have these conversations and figure out, how do we finish strong? How do we retire happy, healthy, and strong? And so, and how do we take these careers that we've chosen to get into that should fill us up? And most of the time they do fill us up, but yet we have a lot of people that are leaving super burned out, angry, frustrated, divorced. And that sucks. And we need to change that stigma. And so thank you for the work that you're doing. We appreciate you joining us here on the Firefighter Craftsmanship Podcast. If you found any value to this, and I hope that you did, please share it. We're trying to grow this thing from the grassroots perspective, and rating this thing on your favorite podcast player, reviewing it if you're willing to do, actually really does help with those bots and those algorithms. And stay smart.